Okay, I've got my attempt 2 set up here. Let me get this going. So we had class and there was several technical difficulties. We're calling it spiritual warfare with the topic, but I'm attempting to record this essentially talking to myself just so I can post it so people who weren't part of the Sunday morning session can kind of keep caught up. So okay, so this will maybe a little bit quicker when I don't have an audience, but generally it's going to be a whole lot of me talking. But the Unseen Realm, this is session 3, Divine Transgressions. I kind of want to pause at the beginning here and recap session 2. Session 2, we've had two sessions, so this is session 3. The first one was more of an introduction in terms of just being open to hearing things and ideas that are in Scripture and the implications of those that may not be comfortable or as familiar to what we grew up with sort of in Sunday school, right? So session 2, we had a couple of things we tried to establish. We established that God has a divine family, you guess heavenly family, a divine council, whatever it is. We wanted to make sure that we're talking about Job, right, when the creation event and how they were the divine household was witness to creation, and it wasn't just the Trinity or just God or Yahweh or the Most High at the creation event. So they were there previously. And the reason I say that is because we don't want the divine household to have the idea that they are a supplement to make Yahweh bigger. It's not adding to the Trinity, or it's not removing, it's not replacing. It's just there's a separate household, a divine household, independent from humanity. We talked a little bit about free will, which is always a fun topic, and how the divine household also had free will. They were also imagers of God. They were imagers of God in the divine realm. And because both humans and the divine had this free will as a part of God's ultimate image or ultimate vision of what he wanted his creation to be, they also had the ability to rebel or choose their own authority in place of God's plan or God's vision or God's authority. Both households experience rebellion. We're very familiar with the human rebellion. We're going to talk a little bit about the divine rebellion and try to figure out how that fits in this picture. The result's going to be a long war against God's original intention. And the last thing we talked about in the previous week was sort of the function of the Satan. And we talked about the Satan and not Satan, capital S, quite a bit. We looked at Job, and there's an interesting sort of kind of play this out a little bit in terms of if there's a divine rebellion and the rebellion of God has a separation from God, then the Satan figure in Job very likely could be a loyal Elohim that was not a rebellious Elohim, but was serving the function of the Satan, which is a prosecutor is the best way to describe it. It becomes an adversary, it becomes things, but the function of the prosecutor or the accuser, the one that's testing, in that case it was Job, testing Job to see if he truly was blameless, is how Satan, capital S, sort of got his proper name. And I kind of make the case that our current existence is Job magnified, where Satan and his other those loyal to him, and the sort of rebellion against God's plan, and for the most part, his second household, the humankind household, God's allowed them a certain authority in this age to do the similar thing that Satan and Job was doing. But it's interesting that Satan was there at the place which is clearly placed way after Adam and Eve in the original fall. So if they were able to have access to God and the divine symbol, that one Satan might have been a loyal Elohim just serving a function, and not necessarily one of the rebellious ones, as it probably gets cast out. But that's an interesting sort of side note in that whole element. So there's a couple things we're going to address here, but mostly we're going to be dealing with the divine rebellion and what we can know about it or not know about it, what the implications are as we go through it. So if we revisit Genesis 3, the question that gets asked in the book is, why was Eve not afraid or not startled when a snake spoke to her? We don't think about this. It's almost as it's such a common story that we grow up with. in church, that, and you see the pictures in Sunday school of the snake twirled around the tree branch and Eve kind of walking gracefully through the Garden of Eden, and it has this sort of sinister, almost like the snake doesn't belong there, just this sort of image and this connotation that's getting there, like there's an intruder into the world that was perfect, and this kind of like almost sleuthily spying and wiggling his way in there. But we don't believe that God was completely unaware of this serpent figure being in Eden. He was most likely allowed to be there at that time. And so there's some connotation there. So why was Eve not startled? Are we saying that all animals spoke in the pre-fall? Is there something with the curse of Adam and the fall that caused all animals to lose vocal abilities? I don't know that's happening, so we'll talk about that. But to understand, you have to sort of put yourself into what the world, what new creation was like pre-fall. We don't get a lot of information. There's not a lot of verses to talk about this. So there's some imagining, if you will, that goes on to try to understand what it was like. But it seems obvious, but just bear with me. So the events leading up to the fall occurred before the fall, duh. But it also is before the separation of humankind and the divine. We also know that God dwelled on earth with his Elohim, with Adam and Eve. You know, so sometimes we think of Eden, brand new creation. This is sort of the same sort of connotation they had with Job, is we always think of creation, it was just God. God was the only one there at creation, and he was the one referring to our image. And then you think of new creation. If you don't have the context of Job and having the divine counsel that he's speaking to in Job to talk about creation, let's go and create humankind and make him in our image, make them imagers. Then you also may not have the connotation of who was dwelling on earth in the new creation. It wasn't just God, it was his entire divine counsel. In fact, there's references to other places in Scripture that talk about Eden being the dwelling, being the meeting place for his divine counsel. So it's not only Adam, Eve, and God, it's Adam, Eve, and the entire divine household. So it's not like there's a little bit of a crowded place. It's not just 3 people in this entire planet. So Eve was created into an environment where conversing with the divine was likely a very normal event. And in some ways, Eve was probably the curiosity of some of these divines, like, ooh, what is God created? What is this new being? What is this human? It's an imager, so I would imagine has some physical recognizable features that that make you the imager of God, just like the divine were imagers of God. But conversing, I don't think there was a separation of converse. God's original intent and his ultimate intent is that the divine household and human household are operating together, ruling and subduing earth and planets and heaven and earth together. That's his original intent, and that's how it was before the fall. There wasn't a separation at this point. And I'm going to make the case that I don't even think there was a divine rebellion at this point. I think the divine rebellion occurs essentially the same time that the fall of man occurs, but we'll get to that in a second. So if you're reading Genesis 3 as an ancient reader, it would have been clear that Eve was conversing with the divine being. You're like, why is that obvious? Why does that seem clear to the ancient reader? So let's talk about that for a little bit. In the context for Genesis 3, in the Near Eastern literature of the Old Testament, animal speech is not uncommon, okay? So be like, okay, well, this, but every time you see animal speech in that Near Eastern literature, it's of magic, which of course has the connotations of the divine or the world of the gods, or it implies something. It's not just animals talking. It's not like Disney now, where you have the sort of sidekick characters talking. We don't now envision animals talking as being a divine, but then a divine being was conveyed through speech of an animal. That's just how, that was a literary tool on how that worked. But you use an example of Egyptians, right? The Egyptians never believed that their pets, their animals, cats were kind of their thing, could talk. They would be just as shocked or startled if their pet started talking to them. So it's no different, I believe, that Eve would have had that same sort of zoology, if you will. We're not talking about sort of a context of zoology, but the animals were the vehicle for manifesting a divine presence or a power in the story. So that's how the authors would communicate that there was a divine being, by speech from an animal. Now, the kind of animal, that would often depend on the characteristics associated with the animal, meaning the author would choose the type of animal to convey certain characteristics about what that divine being intended. I don't think Eve was looking at a serpent, was looking at a snake. I think Eve was speaking with a divine being, one that she probably spoke with many times prior, and the serpent language was intended to convey by the author almost the intent, if you will, of that particular thing. If you think about how we use that guy's a snake, we don't mean that that guy over there is a physical snake. We are intending to assign attributes or characteristics onto that person by calling them a snake, right? Like that's a little bit of what's kind of going on. It's a little more complex than that, but that's sort of an illustration of how that might kind of play out. So that's the context. Now, the point of Genesis 3 is a broader scope. Now, I say point of Genesis 3, what I'm really talking about is more the point of sort of that creation, that Genesis event, which culminates in Genesis 3. So it's not to talk about ancient zoology. It's not to talk about a time when animals could talk. That's not the intent here. It was Genesis was telegraphing very simple but profound ideas to the Israelite leader. And if on the pastoral thing, there's like 5 points here. So there's 5 things. It's the world you experience. So to the Israelite leader, it's like, where's creation? The world you experience was created by an all-powerful God, okay? Human beings are his created representatives, his imagers. Eden was where God lived before the fall or the rebellion. This is where God dwelled. God dwelled with humans until he couldn't any longer post-sin. He was also accompanied by a supernatural host. You get that message through the Genesis to creation account. Let us go and create man in our image. This was a common understanding to that Israelite reader at the time. The final point that's being conveyed here is that the one member of this divine entourage was not pleased with God. There's a jealousy, was not God's decision to create humanity, and especially not pleased with the create humanity and give them dominion, something that they did not even have of the new creation. It's sort of like the new employee comes into town and gets promoted before you, and you're like, what am I doing wrong? How did this play out? This doesn't seem fair. So that gives you some context of what the point of Genesis 3. Now to get into a little bit of the details of this in terms of the serpent figure and this other stuff. I'll pause this. So we kind of all know, like I know, I've always known that the Genesis serpent wasn't a member of the animal kingdom, but I don't know that you ever sort of made the distinction. In my mind, it was always like the Satan or the devil was a shapeshifter and took on the form of a snake. And this gets sort of enhanced with the Sunday school. Every Sunday school lesson, it's this picture of a snake in the garden. So I don't know that I never really thought it was just a created snake that decided to talk to Eve and then became the devil. There was a spiritual being that came and, in my mind, took the shape or the form of a serpent. Now, it's possible that is the case, but I tend to think that the language is more intended to convey that a divine being was there and their intent as the characteristics of the serpent were conveyed onto them. Okay, so the Nakash of Genesis 3, you're like, oh, I don't know what that word is. What in the world? Here we go. So bear with me as we kind of talk about the Hebrew word. So the Hebrew word translated serpent is Nakash. So here's the fun part. The word has a plain meaning and has an elastic one, and we'll get to sort of what a plain and elastic sort of meaning, and I'll give you some examples in English. But the most straightforward meaning that's used by virtually all the translators of the Bible means serpent. So to kind of understand, you're like, well, if that's why everyone's using it, why are you trying to convey something different? I'm not. But let me talk about the other potential meanings behind the word Nakash. So again, we're doing Hebrew grammar. I know there's some intense grammar in this book that I am not a Hebrew expert, so I'm trying to basically regurgitate what I've been told about Hebrew grammar. Let me explain this one. I think it's pretty straightforward. The original Hebrew did not have vowels, and the Nakash root letters without vowels. So how the original word appeared was, as you would translate into English, would be the in, the ka, and the sha, the nkash, the nakash. Okay. So as a noun, which is the most common interpretation of how it's being used, the noun of nkash means serpent. What's interesting, though, is that same word, not changing any letters, right? There's no vowels changing. Nkash as a verb means the diviner. And you're like, okay, what's a diviner? I've never heard of what a diviner is. So a diviner is an ancient word. In the ancient world, was one who was told omens or gave information, and we think like the oracle. So if we talk about the oracle of Delphi in terms of Greek mythology, that's the most common one. Someone who has sort of this divine ability to fortune tell, and fortune telling has become sort of this almost evil deal, but it was someone who gave information is probably the best way to do it. So someone who gave information about future events or what could happen or what would happen. Eve then was getting information from the Nakash, who in a verb sense was a diviner, which was an oracle, someone who is giving her information. So it's possible that she's gotten information from this Nakash previously. And so this information she got this time probably didn't seem anything out of the ordinary and was just how information was given to her. Okay? Please go out. Go out. Sorry. So elastic words in English. I think sometimes when we talk about elastic words, we don't really know what that means, or we don't understand. I don't think of words as being elastic, but I'm going to give you one example, which I think is very common for all of us. So the noun form of running is a good form of exercise. However, running can be a verb form. The engine is running on diesel, right? It has two meanings, and the context and how it's phrased gives you whether it's a noun or a verb. And we don't even think about this in that sense. So when you see the Nakash referred, you could potentially, as a ancient reader, get both meanings without necessarily having to necessarily think about the elasticity of that particular word. So the other thing that I think is important, and there's it's Ezekiel 28 that also says, the serpent was an image that was commonly used as a divine throne room. I said throne. I totally spelled that wrong. Throne room, not throne. There's an example of how English is amazing. Throne room guardian. And so there's some hints in terms of where this things, and you actually get this spelled out for us in Ezekiel 28, that this figure is a guardian cherub. So the combination of the Nakash being a serpent and the serpent being an image to be a guardian throne room, and then in Ezekiel 28 just referencing it as a cherub guardian, all paints this picture of who it is that is this sort of divine adversary in Genesis 3. So we can get a better understanding in terms of what that function was in the divine household that led to this event or this scene that we get in Genesis 3. Let's keep going here. So as the scene unfolds, this divine adversary, which was likely a cherub guardian of the divine council, dispenses information and uses that information to goad Eve. Now, he basically gave her an oracle, gave her information. You won't really die. God knows when you eat, you will become like one of us or become like one of the Elohim, just like I mean. And the phrase there is, you will know good and evil. You become like God and know good and evil. So I mentioned this in class today. There's a whole, the satanic movement, the satanic following, so followers of Satan, actually use this scene as illustration of why Satan is the hero of this story, because God was intentionally not allowing humans to have knowledge, right? Knowledge. They didn't know good and evil. So it gets painted in this thing as we're essentially just sort of like dumb robot, just doop-a-doop-a-doo, naive, oblivious. And it was Satan, or this Nakash, the serpent, that actually freed our minds and brought us the information that we needed to have the knowledge, and that knowledge was then allowing us to sort of develop in the society and the cultures that we have today. So it's actually God is the bad one who created us but just limited us and it pushed us down. It was Satan that freed us. But this is an incomplete understanding of what's being talked about here. Okay? So the first, there's a bunch of it. So I'm going to click all these through and then we'll talk about it as a whole. So when the Elohim created, we talked a little bit last week about salvation. Like, if the divine have free will, do they also have the ability to get salvation after they've rebelled, after they sinned? Humans rebelled and we have a salvation plan. Do the divine have a salvation plan? And the answer was no. So potentially what's happening here is that Yahweh created the Elohim with the knowledge of good and evil. They knew what was right and wrong. Humans were not created with that knowledge. Why? That's a God question. So when was the divine rebellion? So if the Elohim were created with this knowledge of good and evil, they would have known what not necessarily the consequences are. They would have known knowledge, but not had experienced the consequences, right? So you can see kind of how this gets played out in what was the motivation for the Nakash. Okay, we know from Scripture, it clearly states that the Elohim, prior to the fall, that the Elohim knew good and evil. They had the knowledge of good and evil, but humanity did not. And it feels like a weird, uncomfortable passage for us, but I think it's just understanding sort of the divine, the spiritual household and the human household is how this makes it easier for us to understand. So let's kind of look at Eve. Eve gets this bad rap. She gets stereotyped cast as stupid and naive, and that's sort of what that satanic movement is thriving on. It's like, look at Eve, man. She's naive. She just sort of la-di-da-di-da. You told me to do this, and it's not quite accurate. Just think about your situation and put yourself in this situation. She's a new member to this blended household of God. She is literally the first of humans. Adam and Eve. That's it. That's the only humans at this point in the story. And you probably have the entire divine household has already been created, and they're dwelling with her. So she's the new member to the household. It's almost like she's trying to fit in. The divine council dwells in Eden. So the Nakash tells her has a ring of validity to it. And again, keep in mind, we don't know how much time has passed between God's command to not eat of that tree and the event of that fall. It could be multiple years, 10 years. I would bet it's not a couple of days. I would bet there's some time frame here, right? So the Nakash, who's obviously very clever, had probably provided some other information, and sort of was setting the stage for the Genesis 3 account. It's almost like we don't get to see the context leading up to Genesis 3 where the microphone was turned on and recorded for all of history. We don't get to see any of that, and we don't get to see the after. We don't see the event that caused the actual fall. So what he's saying, of course God wants you to be like, I mean, look around. You are the only one. You look just like us. You're human. We're divine. He wants you to be like us. Why would he not want us to represent himself? Why would he kill you? He just created you. He's not gonna, we wouldn't die. That doesn't make any sense. Like, so there's a ring of truth that probably rings through for Eve. Now that doesn't excuse Eve, but it gives you maybe a little bit of perspective when you start thinking about sort of a pre-fall earth rather than just going, man, Adam and Eve just screwed up right out of the gate. Well, we don't know that. It's possible they did pretty well before they got to the position of just understanding their role and they're interacting with the divine as God's original plan was, and that caused the problem. So now let's move over to the Nakash. So the Nakash was jealous of this newly created humanity. If you, in Ezekiel 28, you get a sense of pride, and it was the Nakash, this entity, this being was beautiful, and they had a high rank within the divine household. So you can almost get the sense of everything was fine. Everything was working. And even the Nakash himself did not have an issue with the way things were going prior to humanity. He was cool with it. He had a position of decent authority. He probably envisioned himself a little bit broader than he actually was, but there was no pride or anything going on. Okay, so I think I have kids coming over in a second, so this could be interesting, but we'll shut that down. So the Nakash almost had this jealousy. God approaches the divine council and says, I've got this great plan. I'm going to make humanity. I'm going to make creation. Bam, bing, bing, boom. Look at them. They're humans. And I'm going to give them dominion to all my new toy, the new creation. So you can kind of get this feeling of the guy's like, what in the world did I do to get skipped over? I didn't get the promotion. Like what? Like you can tell there's a lack of perspective for what's actually being created here. So you can say there's a jealousy for this newly created humanity. So the Nakash repelled against God's plan and is aware of good and evil and seduction of sin because he didn't want the humans to basically get the dominion of the things that God was assigning them. So he didn't like that plan. Okay. And again, remember free will, they had the free will to do it. So the desire here was to destroy humanity and return things to how they were. We almost paint this picture that the Nakash, the Satan figure, the devil, the serpent, was always kind of evil and was just setting up his own rule and thought that he was the counterbalance to God, and he created this thing. I think what was probably more going on was his desire here was to destroy humanity and turn back to where it was, almost turn back the clock, if you would. And he was clever, so his intent here was counting on God's justice. He knew God, and he knew God's ability. He knew that God was just. Okay, so because he knew that God was just, the disobedience, he was aware and had knowledge of good and evil, understand, right? So he knew that if the humans rebelled and disobeyed God, God's justice would essentially mean that he would have to eliminate humanity. That would be the just act from God's perspective. So he's sort of taking this information, goading Eve into deciding to disobey God, or making it feel like she's just following the common plan, and it wasn't really disobeying and justifying it in her brain. So God, after the fall, did actually administer the justice that the Nakash was counting on. What the Nakash didn't count on was the timing of the justice. God did not minister justice instantly. He did not do it as swiftly as the Nakash was counting on. The wages of sin is death. This is a common New Testament passage, right? Everyone is going to die because of sin. The cost of sin is death. The Nakash was counting on this, just a lot quicker was what the plan was. This wasn't the plan to give him a whole lifetime in order to sort of get redeemed and have a salvation and have God's plan continue on with humanity. I would make the case that the Nakash was perfectly fine with God's first household, the spiritual. It wasn't until the humans were created into which the rebellion of the divine, of the Nakash, occurred. So you could almost view this as an attempt. He's like, how can I pull this off? How can I do good evil and just the newly created humans who are my rival now? They've been given dominion, and I don't like that dominion. How can I get them to basically self-incriminate? I know, I'll get them to disobey God, and God will have no choice but to eliminate humans, and leaving essentially this new creation, this new heavens, a new earth with, I can be the now dominion. Maybe I can gain dominion that way, because this place is pretty cool. So that Kosh was trying to use God's justice to eliminate his rival, but have it done in such a way where he's trying to almost trick God, which is an interesting concept in itself, into going, gee shucks, I guess humanity was a bad idea. Hey, maybe I'll just let you guys take over this. We'll stick with that one original family how it had in the first place. And that's not obviously how it played out. So you can kind of see how this whole scenario played. It was it was rebellion, but I don't know that the Nakash was intending at that point the result that it came from, or what it resulted in, was not necessarily the intent that he was going for. I got a message that says my internet connection is unstable, so we'll make sure, so hopefully this is still working. Nope, it looks like I'm frozen over here. Oh, I think I'm back. Okay, I keep going. This is what. Oh, the internet. Okay. Divine judgment. So the curse levied at Adam in Genesis 3, it looks like this is working. It's a little delayed, but the curse levied at Adam in Genesis 3 did not supersede God's mandate to subdue the earth and take dominion. It's an important point. We're very aware of it, right? We know this because we're here now, but the curse levied at Adam did not override, supersede God's mandate to subdue the earth and take dominion. It just made it significantly more difficult. So the expulsion of humankind from Eden turned this glorious dominion, this utopia of where we live, into this mundane drudgery. It's now just far more difficult. It's work, and not in the sense that's a good thing. It's a toil instead of just I'm doing work and I love what I'm doing and there's results and this kind of stuff. There's a difference there. We already know, obviously, that God was going to take steps to restore his rule and that the descendants of Adam would be a critical part of that kingdom. The judgment of Eve, notice it's the judgment and not the curse. It's an interesting differentiator there. Also doesn't preclude the mandate to multiply, go forth and multiply. It just makes it more painful. So there's these complications and challenges that have been added to the original mandate to subdue the earth, and go forth and multiply. The curse of the Nakash also tells us that the Nakash would also have offspring. So now we know that Adam and Eve are going to have offspring, and the Nakash is going to have offspring. And now you're going, time out. What in the world are you talking about? You're saying that the divine being is going to have children? Well, not entirely. And we're going to look at that right now because I think it's important to address this, because the scripture definitely refers to offspring of the Nakash. So the offspring of the Nakash, we know from other passages in the Bible, is different than Eve's offspring. Eve's offspring is what we know. We have kids, there's a generation, there's children, there's physical childbearing. This is what happens. The Nakash would bear spiritual offspring. And you're like, aren't you kind of playing with the words here? Like, I'm just making it talk about how people are using other stuff to reimagine it for himself, and now you're saying that the Nakash only have spiritual offspring, even though the same words used. Here's the reference. John 8:44. Jesus, seems like a good source, told the Pharisees, "You are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father." He additionally goes and refers to the Pharisees as serpents, Nakash, and offspring of vipers. It's an interesting use of the word offspring of vipers, especially when you have Nakash translated as serpent, and Jesus' time of Pharisees. Is Jesus saying that the Pharisees were literally physically born of vipers? No, that's obviously not what's intended, but he's using the term offspring of vipers. You also compare that and you go to 1 John 3:8-12. John the Apostle expresses this whole notion of spiritual seed, of good seed and evil seed, and how it can manifest itself in the human heart. There's a whole concept here playing out of spiritual seed, spiritual offspring, that is originating from this Genesis 3 scene. So that when we talk about the Nakash having offspring, this is what it's meant. Then Jesus is clarifying it, and the Apostle John is also clarifying that it's not the divine are having children, it's that they have spiritual followers, spiritual offspring, people who are going to continue to follow this rebellion. It's not going to be a one-time event. And that's the whole point of that Genesis 3 offspring. So if you go and kind of do the conclusion of revisiting Genesis 3, at a very simple, clean level, Genesis 3 tells us why we die, why we need redemption, why we need salvation, and why we cannot save ourselves. That is the function of Genesis 3. So as I'm explaining this, the rebellion of the divine, I believe, occurred essentially as the fall of man, fall of humankind. Now, there's references in Revelation that talk about a third of the angels. How does that fit into this whole equation? I don't know that I have a perfect theological answer for it, but you could see if the Nakash knew what he was intending to do, it's also possible there was sort of this recruiting of going, are you kidding me? God made humans. He's basically saying, I'm not satisfied with you, therefore I'm going to go make something better to replace you. And you can see that there's probably in other passages, don't you know that we will judge angels, that humans were elevated to a position that these divine beings, these Elohim, knew that they were basically not, they took it as being replaced, or we aren't good enough. Therefore, if we're not good enough, let's go do our own thing. And you can kind of see how this sort of movement of rebellion develops. And that's where you get to the second thing. So that's where the initial divine rebellion occurred. And that also might be the point in time for the divine where the knowledge of good and evil became the experience of good and evil. And even though the loyal Elohim did not experience the rebellion, they could visually experience it with the other Elohim, and now they have the knowledge and the experience of good and evil and know that they don't want to go down that road. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. So there's another divine rebellion, but I want to make the distinction of the divine rebellion that we just talked about that occurs, in my opinion, in Genesis 3 versus this divine rebellion, a secondary one that occurs in Genesis 6. We just talked about how the seed of the Nakash was a spiritual seed, and that spiritual seed was known and going to carry on and continue. So let's read Genesis 6, 1 through 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took them as their wives as they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in, the footnote says, or contend with man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim, footnote, or giants, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. It clearly talks about the sons of God came into the daughters of man and bore children to them. So now suddenly there's this additional rebellion that's occurring. Now, before we get down that road, I want to talk about the more common explanation for this particular passage. This is kind of a bizarre passage. There's what's in the theological world called the Sethite interpretation. So I want to talk about that for a little bit. The Sethite interpretation is basically taking that passage and trying to explain the sons of God, daughter of humans, daughter of men. So this is merely a description under this interpretation of men from the line of Cain intermarrying with women from the line of Seth. And that's the distinction they're going to make between Cain and Seth, sons of God, daughters of humans. How are they doing this? Seth was a son of Adam and Eve after Cain killed Abel. Genesis 4:26 actually has a reference to Seth giving birth to a son, and in the same verse there's a passage that states, and at that time men began to call on the name of the Lord. So the interpretation here is basically saying that the line of Seth, because it's so closely in scripture aligned with the birth of Seth's son, was to remain pure, and they were the ones that are calling the name of the Lord, and they were, in this reference, the sons of God. Now this doesn't, I don't know how this meshes with Job and Psalm 82, but this is how they're doing it. So it's and the Cain was separate and was the evil lineage because Cain murdered Abel. Okay, so this is sort of like, hey, Cain did a bad thing, therefore he is forever evil. Seth, oh, his reference for Seth, and right after they talk about being good. So Seth must be always good. So Seth is going to be evil, or Seth's going to be good, Cain's going to be evil. That must be what this passage is passing about. This is the most common explanation when they believe in church. And the only thing that can cause this, the reason that this would even is to whitewash the supernatural nature of this and not have an true understanding of the supernatural worldview that it was intending. Now, if you look at the issues with this, there's many issues, but just as a very basic, going through some very basic points here that I think will explain why this is a problematic way to explain this, is Genesis 4:26 never says that only people who call on the name of the Lord from Seth's lineage. It just says at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. There's a time period stamped there, but it's not necessarily a who stamp there. The who gets interpreted or implied onto the scripture passage. This whole view of the Seth and Cain lineages has no ability to explain the Nephilim, which are giants. It's somehow you have to sort of imagine that there's a magic power of the intermarrying of these two lines that creates giants. There's no way to explain the Nephilim. The text also never calls the women daughters of Cain, but rather daughters of humankind. And given the sort of emphasis that the scripture has on lineages and stuff like that, you'd think that if that was the intent of the author, they would basically state it. But no, it states daughters of humankind. So the idea that they're from Seth, the sons of God were from Seth, and the daughters of Cain are from the women are from Cain, is imposed on the text, is likely an attempt to make the passage easier to explain. There's no command in the text regarding prohibition against marrying certain persons. There's no distinction. There's no Jew and Gentile. There's no separate. It's just humankind. There's also nothing in the Bible identifies the people of Seth's lineage as being sons of God. It's an imposing of the scripture in order to explain this. And the problem here is that it doesn't have any ability to connect to other passages. You can maybe buy it for this one picture. If you remember, I called about the correlation. We have one picture and you zoom out and it all connects and shows this bigger picture. They're creating an image that doesn't fit in with the other context. Psalm 82 is the one we started this whole thing of the divine council scene. This is the Son of God. Sons of God are used there and many other places that aren't referenced in terms of Seth's line or this. So you're imposing context, imposing things on the text in order to remove the supernatural worldview. So a simple reading of this, just read it plainly, makes it very clear that there's a contrast being made with sons of God, Elohim, and daughters of humankind. Otherwise, why would you even make the distinction of God and of humans? It's to say that humans are evil? Well, I mean, okay, maybe, I guess, but it just seems like you're trying to remove the sons of God. There's a couple of passages in the New Testament that are actually interesting to look at. Peter and Jude. So 2 Peter 2, 1 through 10. I'm not going to go find the passages for time, but I have some bullet points to kind of summarize what is being stated in this passage. One of the passages in it says, "For God did not spare angels when they sinned." Okay, well, angels sinned, so there's a reference to angels rebelling. They rebelled. He did not spare the angel world, but preserved Noah. Okay, so now you get a little time frame of what we're talking about and when this was occurring. He brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemns them to extinction. Okay, well, this maybe gives us some hints into what the angels' rebellion involved. It's being compared to Sodom and Gomorrah. I wonder what that could possibly mean. Now we look at Jude 1, verse 5 through 7, 3 verses. The angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, again, reference to angels rebelling. They left their proper position of authority. And here's more context for Sodom and Gomorrah. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality, ... This now tells us exactly what the angel's sin and the rebellion involved. It involved a sexual nature. Okay, well, if you look at Peter and Jude, both those passages describe an episode from the time of Noah or early in human history and the flood where angels sinned. That sin was a sexual nature being compared to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Peter and Jude interpret it as evidence of despising authority. I'm going to talk about free will and choosing our own authority over God's, despising authority and the boundaries of their proper dwelling. Okay? So Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is the only reference to any divine sin that meets all the descriptions 2 Peter and Jude reference. So it's interesting that the Jewish tradition before the New Testament took the supernatural over 6 and 4. It wasn't an issue for them. They just viewed that as the sons of God, fallen angels, intermarrying with humans and taking them as wives. And that was just an accepted thing. It wasn't even a weird thing to be kind of talking about. What's also interesting, it wasn't until the 4th century that this Genesis 6:4 began to remove the supernatural orientation. Now, here's the thing is, our theology, we talked a little bit of this in session 1, does not come from tradition. It doesn't come from church fathers through history reinterpreting passages. It comes from the biblical text. And I think that's why God's given us the Bible, so we can see the original intent that he had and not have it be interpreted for us. One of the coolest things about our religion is we can go straight to God. We can see the holy passages and we can review it ourselves. It doesn't mean there's not room for teachers or interpreters stuff like that, but you can cross-check everything you want, and you don't have to rely on anyone to tell you what to believe. You can believe and create your worldview yourself. So our theology comes from the text, not traditions. So the supernatural worldview was not an unusual thing for the believers up to the 4th century. That's kind of a thing. So now let's go back and talk about the Nephilim. The Nephilim can't be explained by the Sethite view, right? So Jewish scholars from the Second Temple period viewed the offspring from Genesis 6:1-4 as giants. You saw when I put the passage up there that the footnote even says giants. So there's a book called the Septuagint. Now, the reason why the Septuagint is useful because it's like the original translation from the original Hebrew into Greek. Why they do that? Because the New Testament is largely in Greek. So to sort of have the Old Testament and New Testament in a single language, they translated the Hebrew into Greek, and they called that Old Testament the Septuagint. Okay, so in the Septuagint, the word Nephilim occurs twice in the Hebrew Bible. It occurs in Genesis 6, which is the passage we're talking about, and it occurs in Numbers 13, which is another passage we'll get to at a later point when we start talking about the conquest. In both cases, the Septuagint translates the term with gigas, which means giant. So it's not that the Nephilim are just some sort of other normal humans. There is something unique about them. There is a gigantic aspect to them physically. And so the Nephilim have to be the result of this divine rebellion and the sons of God taking daughters of the humankind as wives and having children. So what's interesting is when you talk about the rebellion, you talk about the knowledge of good and evil. It was almost as if that first divine rebellion, God was going to judge them. They didn't have a salvation plan, but they were allowed to essentially continue to exist and continue to function. But these specific angels, you can almost play this out in your head going, well, okay, we don't have the power or ability to directly destroy humans. We attempted to get rid of them by the Genesis 3 story. Well, maybe now we're already cast, we're already separated, we've already rebelled. Maybe now what we can do is we'll go and try to interbreed with them, which is a whole conversation that I'm not prepared to have because I don't know how that works, because they can't interbreed. So maybe they can only breed with females. I don't know. Maybe there are no female. I don't know. It's a bizarre sort of thing in itself. But by doing that, they kind of doubled down on their rebellion. You get to go down and be in chains until the day of judgment, and you don't get to go do a thing. So it's almost like there's a separate rebellion after the first rebellion that God had to be more active with punishment quickly than it was. It sort of caught his ire more than it did in the first rebellion of attempting to do things. So we're going to talk, the Nephilim come up quite a bit in this whole series because there's so much you can kind of gain from the reference of Nephilim and the conquest. They come up against with the numbers references. So real quick, the session summary. The serpent of Genesis 3 was a divine being, not merely a talking animal, which I think we understand that. The Nakash of Genesis 3 was divine. It was likely originally a divine throne room guardian, which is an interesting context because that means he came from a position of authority, but was also a created and part of the hierarchy. We talked about this with the Job and the Satans. It's probably more likely that while a position of authority existed for the Nakash in Genesis 3, there was not an equal, balanced co-ruler, if you will, with God. This was a subordinate to God that decided that they were jealous of the human creation thing. That knowing good and evil comes from rebellion, both human and divine. I think I wish I could retype that. It's not knowing good and evil. We talked about the divine created were likely to have been created with the knowledge of good and evil, but it wasn't until the rebellion that they had the experience of good and evil. And at that experience is when you have sort of the moment of splitting for the divine. You have the loyal to Yahweh, and you have the disloyal, the choosing their own authority, of their own abilities in reaction to the creation of humankind. So I think you can make a pretty clear case that the creation of humans is what actually caused ultimately the divine rebellion, and the divine rebellion coincided almost exactly the same time as the human fall and human rebellion, the sin. So that Genesis 3 is a tipping point for both households in terms of a separating point. So that was a major, major event for the timeline of humans. The rebellion of man did not extinguish the plan for God's human household. It just made it more difficult and kind of delayed it. The Nakash relied on God's justice, we talked about this, which was a true justice. God was just and is just. The justice wasn't executed in the way the Nakash had hoped, which would be an instant elimination of man and leaving us back to just the spiritual household, and they could kind of go back to where it used to be, but now they have this new creation that they can kind of, and maybe the spiritual household will be given dominion. And since the Nakash had a relative authority, position of authority, they would have a significant amount of dominion given to them in this new creation, but that wasn't how it played out. The second rebellion that we kind of talk about is this Genesis 6:1-4, which is about the divine going down and taking human wives and creating the Nephilim as their offspring, these giant beings. Peter and Jude view this Genesis 6 passage as being of supernatural orientation, and so it seems very clear for just a plain reading of Scripture that the Nephilim are the product of this divine sin of the angels leaving their proper dwelling place. And the angels sinning in that particular regard. So the last thing we talked about this morning that I want to kind of, that's not necessarily in the slides, was a question that Megan had brought up, was essentially like, if there's free will and the ability to rebel, why will history not repeat itself on the other side of Jesus' return? New heaven, new earth, we still have the free will, we still have the powers. If the divine rebelled and the humans rebel, why would we not do this again if we still continue to have free will? So I've kind of alluded to this a little bit, right? It's the divine and human rebellions are kind of exist at the same time. There's not a salvation plan for the divine household because they were already created with the knowledge of good and evil, whereas humans were not created with the knowledge of good and evil. You can see that in reference in Genesis 3 as well, verse 26, I believe. And so the plans for his household are different. There's almost a more direct punishment and decision that's being made by the divine because they were created with this knowledge of good and evil, and knowing everything there is to know about God, and knowing the knowledge of good and evil, and still deciding to rebel against God's plan was all the decision that God needed from them. There wasn't a, okay, you get this one chance to go over. Humans inherited this rebellion, and so as such, our decision we get to make occurs throughout our lifetime. And so we have to decide in our lifetime whether or not we're going to rebel, choose our own authority, or whether or not we're going to follow Yahweh and follow God. So humans essentially have a lifetime to make that decision, where the divine made that decision essentially at the same time, whether they were going to follow the Nakash of Genesis 3 or stay loyal to Yahweh. So I equated this morning to sort of at the time of the new heaven, new earth, we're going to have a more complete understanding of the consequences of sin. We know sin's bad, and we know it has bad consequences, but I don't think we truly know how bad it is until we get to the other side of this, and that sin is removed, before we totally can almost look back and go, wow, that is incredibly disgusting. I don't want anything to do with it. So I equated this morning, it's just almost like, if you're standing on the top of a bridge or a cliff and you look down, you know you have the free power to jump off, but you know the consequences is essentially death. So you don't. So it's not that you have lost your free will to do it. There's just no desire whatsoever to do this anymore, because you completely understand and have the complete full capacity to understand the consequences of not being able to survive without God. And God's plan is the best plan, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do to choose your own authority. You're just going to know that God's authority is the best choice. And so you're just not going to have the desire to sin, which in effect is going to eliminate sin and not have a cause for a sort of history repeating itself of things. I think if there wasn't an intent or purpose for our current phase in God's plan, that the current phase is to allow us to become like Christ and to learn and to be able to appreciate God's plan and gift for us, and so that we're purging that desire for sin, and it's going to become even just as plain as day, as obvious as you can be, once the fallen angels have been removed, the rebellious angels have been removed, the temptations removed, that sin is removed, and suddenly we can look back and go, oh my goodness, why in the world did we ever sin in the first place? And you're not going to have the desire. That's where that, I think, is coming from. Okay, so that's it. That's session 3, divine transgressions. We're going to talk next week in session 4. We're going to start talking about cosmic geography, which is a whole nother layer of this that is a fascinating element that's kind of seen in you probably will never see the Tower of Babel story the same again. So that'll be next week in session 4. Hopefully this was a little smoother for those of you who watched the Sunday morning version versus now. This came across a little bit smoother, a little bit cleaner than I did this morning. But for those of you, this is the first time you saw it, congratulations. You didn't have to mess with the chaos that was this morning. Anyway, thank you guys.